Well, okay, here's an opportunity for me to correct some of my technical mistakes that I made in my first video today from where I showed my old school where I went and all that. Okay, this is the picture from the 1970s of the little store that was across the street from the school. Bill's Groceteria. It was owned by a fellow by the name of Bill Schaefer. Anyway, this picture was taken back in the 70s. I might have actually been in that crowd waiting to get into the store. They only used to let two of us in at a time because it was a small store. But if I happened to be fortunate to have money that day, I might have been in that crowd. I don't know, but anyway, we didn't have a lot of money back then. Everything was dirt cheap, but there was no money, so it kind of balanced out, I guess. Anyway, this is a picture of it when it was operational as a store. This next picture here is how it looked after it was closed down. This is right after it got closed up. They'd removed the sign from the roof and all that, and that's how it looked after it got closed up. Okay, that's around 1980 I took that picture. Okay. And of course, oh, wait a minute. Here we go. I'm losing everything. Here we go now. Oh, there we go. I'm flubbing things up again. And there's how it looks today. Okay. Personally, I don't find that very attractive, but I think it looked better the way it looked before when it was a store, but still, that's how it looks today. I find most things nowadays just don't look attractive, or they don't have the character or whatever that they used to have. I kind of grieve about that anyway. I like how the world looked when I was young. But anyway, there it is. Now, the big thing that I flubbed up was my story about Robert Lyon, who was he was the victim of the last fatal duel in Canada, which occurred in Perth, Ontario, Canada. There is talk that there was a duel after that was really the last fatal duel in Canada, but that one doesn't count because it occurred after dueling had been declared illegal. This particular duel in which Robert Lyon was killed, it was an actual legal duel under the law. Anyway, that's the house that Robert Lyon lived in. And it's the house where he died because his body was he was brought mortally wounded back to the house and died on the parlor floor in the house. The house is called Ingava, and it is on the corner across from the school that I went to when I was a little boy. So anyway, that's the story there. Let's turn on the light now so we can see Rocky, because it's always nice to look at Rocky because he's beautiful. There he is. He's having a sleep. He's just laid out there sleeping. Quite the cat, I'll tell you. Anyway, on with the show. The last fatal duel occurred in 1833, and it was a duel between two law students. One of them was a fellow by the name of Robert Lyon, and Robert Lyon, he ended up becoming the fatality of the duel. The other law student involved in the duel was a fellow by the name of John Wilson, and John Wilson, he survived. He lived a long life after that. The duel was over a woman, a school teacher by the name of Elizabeth Hughes. Now, as far as I know from what I remember of the story, Elizabeth Hughes was engaged to Robert Lyon. John Wilson liked Elizabeth Hughes. He was kind of a rival of Robert Lyon for the affections of Elizabeth Hughes. Robert Lyon had a friend by the name of Henry Lelivier. And Henry Lelivier was a bit of a troublemaker. And Henry Lelivier was a bit of a troublemaker. And Henry, he convinced Robert Lyon that John Wilson was saying some nasty things about Elizabeth Hughes. Now, whether this was true or not, I don't know. I think that Henry Lelivier was just stirring things up and trying to get a fight going, and probably trying to eliminate some competition, because he also had taken an interest in Elizabeth Hughes. Anyway, he was Robert Lyon's friend. He set Robert Lyon up to be shot. So, you know what they say, with friends like that, do you really need enemies? Anyway, Robert Lyon was so incensed by what Henry Lelivier had told him about what John Wilson had been saying about Elizabeth Hughes, that Robert Lyon, he decided to confront John Wilson about it. Of course, John Wilson denied the whole thing. John Wilson claimed that he had not ever said any such thing. He never said anything bad about Elizabeth Hughes, and he may have been telling the truth. I don't know. But I do know that Henry Lelivier wasn't really somebody to be trusted, and the story had come from him. But Robert Lyon did believe the story, and so when John Wilson denied it, that didn't go over well with Robert Lyon. So it ended up Robert Lyon and John Wilson had agreed they would engage in a duel with pistols. Now, the way this worked is, in order for it to be a legal duel, there was a bunch of things had to happen. There was a certain procedure had to be followed, and so on. Now, each duelist would have what they called a second of his choosing, and a second was an assistant, basically. And the second also did all the go-between work between the duelist. So basically, if you and I were going to have a duel, I would appoint a second, an assistant, and you would appoint a second, an assistant for yourself. And then our seconds would be the ones who made all the arrangements for the duel. They'd be the ones who looked after the weapons, and so on like that. And it would be their job also to possibly negotiate a peace settlement before we killed each other. That's basically it, to prevent us from killing each other if at all possible. Anyway, Robert Lyon and John Wilson met with their seconds at a place by the river, by the Tay River in Perth, which is now known as Last Duel Park. And they had changed gunfire. They had dueling pistols. They changed gunfire. The pistols that they used are actually on display in the Perth Museum on Gore Street in Perth, called the Matheson House Museum. When I used to work in the Perth Museum, they were there. I remember seeing them. They were on display in there. I even handled them. But anyway, those were the pistols that were used in the duel. They were like an old ball type thing. They shot a big ball, and they weren't very accurate, even at close range. And what had happened was John Wilson and Robert Lyon, they had changed gunfire. They pointed their pistols and fired, and they both missed. Now, the way things worked with a duel, in order for a duel to be legal, if neither party was hit and in the first exchange of gunfire. Then the seconds, Lyon's second and Wilson's second, were to come together, and they were to discuss if there was a possibility of peace between the two men. If they could arrange, for basically a ceasefire, a peace treaty, or whatever, Lelevier, Lyon's second, Henry Lelevier, absolutely refused to negotiate for peace. And so that put the two men in a position where they had to fire on each other again. The second time they changed gunfire, John Wilson's his gun actually worked the way it's supposed to, and the musket ball, or whatever it was, the big ball fired from his gun, did actually hit Robert Lyon, and it was a fatal shot. Robert Lyon fell to the ground, bleeding profusely. He was still alive, though. He didn't die immediately. Some of the people who were there witnessing the thing tore a shutter off a nearby house, and they put Robert Lyon onto the shutter, and they used the shutter basically as a they used it as a conveyance, basically, to get Robert Lyon back to his house, this house here. Robert Lyon was a lawyer. Well, he was an apprentice lawyer, basically, and he was studying under his father, who had a law practice downtown. Not his father, his uncle, I'm sorry. I'm screwing it up again here. He was studying under his uncle, who had a practice downtown, and his uncle's last name, again, I got this wrong in the first video. I said Radcliffe. It wasn't Radcliffe, it was Radenhurst. His last name was Radenhurst, and he had a law practice downtown. In fact, you can't see it anymore, but when I was young, there's a building downtown, and on the stonework of the building, you could actually see the sign, where the sign had been painted, Radenhurst at law, or whatever. That was the Radenhurst Law Office, where Robert Lyon worked under his uncle. Anyway, they carried, basically, they used the shutter. They used a shutter from a nearby house as a stretcher. That's the word I was looking for. Loaded Robert Lyon's body onto the shutter and used it as a stretcher on which to carry him home to his house. I believe that was his uncle's house, Radenhurst House, too. I don't think he owned a house yet, but he was staying there anyway. And it ended up, I'm not sure if it was his uncle's house, though. I believe it was, but I wouldn't want to swear to it. It may have been somebody else's house who he was staying at. I'm not 100%. Anyway, it ended up that he died there on the parlor floor, and the blood stains remained in the floor. And in fact, my grandpa and my father both saw the blood stains, because they were in that house at some point, and they actually saw the blood stains on the parlor floor. They were still there, even after 100 years, more than 100 years. The blood stains were still there, because this duel occurred in 1833. Robert Lyon is buried at the old cemetery in Perth. I've actually seen his grave. I've been there. I've seen his grave, and he's buried there. And anyway, John Wilson went on to marry Elizabeth Hughes. By all accounts, it was not a happy marriage. They were never truly happy with each other. You can imagine starting out that way in life. That would be pretty, with somebody being shot to death. Also, John Wilson went on to be a provincial court judge. Now, after the duel, John Wilson was put on trial for murder, and he was acquitted because it was determined that he had followed, and the others involved had all followed the law. Dueling was legal, and dueling wasn't outlawed in Canada until 1844, so like 11 years after this duel took place. And so John Wilson was acquitted of murder on the basis of the fact that it was a duel and it was perfectly legal at the time. Now, John Wilson ended up becoming the judge in that courtroom. Decades later, as an older man, he had worked his way up through the ranks, I guess, of the law, and he became a judge, and he was appointed to that courtroom in Brockville, Ontario. He was actually tried for murder in Brockville, Ontario, and he ended up being a judge in the same courtroom where he had been tried for murder. In fact, on his first day as a judge there, he was found alone in the courtroom. He was sitting there crying, and whoever it was that came across him asked him why he was so upset, why he was crying, and he said so many years ago, he said the number of years it was, and he said, I was on trial for murder in this very courtroom. I guess it hit him pretty hard when he ended up being the judge in the courtroom where he had been on trial for murder years before. Like I say, he was acquitted because what he did was legal at that time. And that's the story. That's the story of Robert Lyon and John Wilson and Elizabeth Hughes and Henry Lelevier. I don't know what became of Henry Lelevier after all that. I kind of hope that he was ran out of town on a rail because that's what he deserved, but I don't know. I really don't know what happened to him. I never thought very much of that guy anyway. Just from hearing the story over the years, he seems like he was just a real scoundrel. And he set his friend up to be shot in order to eliminate the competition because he also was interested in this Elizabeth Hughes. Elizabeth Hughes must have been quite a woman, that's all I can say. She must have been. Anyway, there's your story. There's the story told in its entirety with hardly any screw-ups this time. That's it for now anyway. We'll talk to y'all later. We'll close with another picture of Rocky because he's very photogenic and we love him. There he is, and he's having a nice sleep. All right, bye for now.